on the cleaning out of the bad leadership and the restoration of true leadership, which is kind of what we'll be about today. So here's a different little chronology you can see. Jonah, kind of the first half of Jeroboam. You got Amos, kind of at the end of Jeroboam. You've got Hosea, who is somewhere around Jotham, Ahaz. And then you've got Micah, right up to, during, and maybe even after the fall of Israel. And then Isaiah is down there at the bottom, just for context. He's ministering during the time of Ahaz, primarily. So here's another timeline. You can see kind of how they match up and overlap and so on. So, Book of Micah. And I mentioned this last time. The book is more or less, I think, divided into three sections. You've got the first section, which is chapters 1 and 2, which is just sort of his lament, his acknowledgement of what's happening. The Assyrians are coming, judgment is coming. And then the third section, which will be the last two chapters, is his personal declaration of judgment against Israel, why Israel deserves what's going to happen, or what is currently happening. And then in the middle, you've got chapters 3, 4, and 5, which is what I'm going to call his sermon on leadership. Specifically, and even then we can kind of break it into two parts. You've got chapter 3, which is mainly his condemnation of the current leadership establishment, which he feels like is partly or mainly responsible for the their situation. And then 4 and 5, which is about turning over the leadership to the true king and what that means. So today we'll be in chapters 3 through 5, again, what I call Micah's sermon on leadership. And it begins in verse 1. Then I said, "Now listen, leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. Aren't you supposed to know what is just? You hate good and love evil." That's pretty straightforward, right? As leaders, you should know what justice is. And they end up doing the opposite, right? They hate good, they love evil. Amos basically says the same thing. He's in his condemnation of Israel that they hate evil. He says they're supposed to hate evil and love good. They're supposed to establish justice, but he knows that they haven't. And of course, Hosea has sort of the same thing. Hosea gives us kind of the other side of that Israel has rejected what is good. So Amos sets up that this is how they're supposed to be, but they're not. Hosea reiterates that, yes, they're not doing what is good. They have rejected justice and so on. But all of this is really articulated, developed by Isaiah. So he has a couple of places that he says it, but perhaps most famously is in chapter 5. "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And as I've kind of already pointed out, Isaiah, Micah are contemporaries. Isaiah might be a little bit older, but they're both ministering during the build-up to the fall of Israel and perhaps during the fall. As I've also kind of joked about, that I feel like Micah in some ways is sort of taking some of Isaiah's ideas, perhaps appropriating or using them for his own use. This is something that plenty of scholars have pointed out, that there's a lot of parallels, but also contrasts. So Isaiah, he had some sort of official status in Jerusalem, whereas Micah seems to be from a more obscure, perhaps rustic settlement. Isaiah had political clout, whereas Micah was perhaps more of a circuit preacher, again, kind of more lower status. And Isaiah is dealing a lot with political issues, more, I guess you could say, highfalutin type of ideas, whereas Micah is more down to earth, perhaps. But again, they're dealing with a lot of the same issues. They're overlapping a lot, but there's also some differences. So in verse 2, "You tear off people's skin and strip their flesh from their bones. You eat the flesh of my people after you strip the skin from them and break their bones." That's pretty harsh. Now, I don't know if they're literally cannibalizing their own people. My assumption is not, but the imagery is there, and it's pretty vivid. It's, I think, fairly close, fairly similar to what we've already seen in Hosea. Again, and part of this whole process, this whole study, is to show how certain ideas, how the prophets are developing one from the next, how they're carrying forward things. So Hosea, back in chapter 4, had said, "They feed on the sin of my people. They have an appetite for their transgressions." Hosea is talking about how the leadership, both political and religious leadership, has failed, and how they've basically through their mismanagement of God's people, they themselves are sort of feeding themselves, gorging themselves off of God's people. And the ones who will really develop this idea is Ezekiel as well as Zechariah. They have a lot to say about how the leaders who are supposed to be ministering to God's flock, supposed to be like shepherds, but instead they're eating God's flock. Right? So we can see the kind of the reversal of that. And this is perhaps best articulated by Jesus himself, right? When he says to Peter, when he's like, Peter, do you love me? And he goes, then you need to feed my sheep, right? Because the flock is God's flock. And the leaders are the shepherds taking care of God's flock. They're supposed to tend to them. That doesn't mean they're allowed to eat them. Again, I don't think this is literal, but we're talking about that metaphorically, right? You are not to enrich yourselves or to enjoy God's flock, because again, it's God's flock. So again, we see this whole idea develop pretty consistently and thoroughly. Well, instead of serving God's people, right, they're pocketing, they're enriching themselves. And then I love the metaphor. I love where he goes with this. In verse 3, you chop them up like flesh for a cooking pot, like meat in a cauldron. So this is very vivid. He isn't going to go any further than this. And this is why I have to I'm trying to go through them chronologically, but I can't because we're not going to talk about him. But Ezekiel has this whole elaborate metaphor. He just goes on and on and on. He doesn't want to let go. And then he leaves it. He comes back to it. The whole cooking pot metaphor. And he doesn't end it. But in Ezekiel 11, the city is the pot, and we are the meat. Therefore prophesy against them, prophesy, Son of Man. So you have this very, very elaborate metaphor where apparently the leaders of the city called the city the pot, and that they were using it as a term of protection or status or something like that, that God was storing them for a good reason. And then almost like in Micah-esque imagery, or kind of turning it in a more Micah direction, verse 7, therefore this is what the Lord says, the slain you have put within it are the meat, and the city is the pot, but I will remove you from it. So again, just to kind of summarize what Ezekiel is doing, he's taking this saying or metaphor that the leaders of Jerusalem have taken, and then he turns it and says, okay, yes, you are in the pot, and now I'm going to turn the fire up. I'm now going to cook the pot. So, but again, I've removed the people I want out of the pot, and then what's left is going to get cooked. Mainly talking about the leaders and the people who are evil. So those who are left to cook are getting judged, essentially. So again, the whole point is, again, Micah has this whole cooking pot metaphor that Ezekiel just runs with and does some weird stuff with it. But anyway, I like Ezekiel. So verse 4, then they will cry out to the Lord, but he will not answer them. He will hide his face from them at that time because of the crimes they have committed. We'll clarify this, but verse 5, this is what the Lord says concerning the prophets who lead my people astray, who proclaim peace, when they have food to sink their teeth into, but declare war against the one who puts nothing in their mouths. So he's kind of coming back to the idea that they are, God has provided for them, and yet they are still eating what they shouldn't eat, right? They are enriching themselves, they're gorging themselves, and that it's put them at odds with Yahweh. And I just can't help myself because I love pointing this out. The idea of, because it seems to be a very strong, very negative image, that when you have someone who has enriched himself or fattened himself off of the people inappropriately or whatever. And the best example of this, because I just can't help it, is back in Judges. So in Judges 3:17, you have Ehud brought the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was an extremely fat man. So Eglon is this mob boss who lives out in the desert, who's enriched himself off of God's people. And the author of Judges didn't need to tell us this. But he had to. He just had to. He had to let us know that Eglon was very, very fat. So fat that he had trouble walking. Like, that's how large this man was. And so you got this very fat gangster living out in the desert. He's basically Jabba the Hutt, right? He's just the Jabba of the Bible. I have no idea if Jabba was based on Ehud or on Eglon, but I'd like to think he was. But that's kind of where we are with Israel, right? The leaders have enriched themselves. They have fattened themselves off of God's people, and God is not happy with this. We kind of saw this earlier in chapter 2, where God has sent prophets, he's sent ministers to talk, they haven't listened to them, to the point where if someone does come, he's just preaching wind, he's preaching, bad things or useless things, and all they want to hear and talk about is good times, right? They'll preach about beer and wine, because that's all people want to hear, that's all the leaders want to hear. Verse 6, therefore it will be night for you without visions, it will grow dark for you without divination. The sun will set on these prophets, and the daylight will turn black over them. Then the seers will be ashamed, and the diviners disappointed. They will cover their mouths, because there will be no answer from God. Now, we've already had this warning. This was back from Amos 8. So he told us, hear this, the days are coming. This is the declaration of the Lord God, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of bread or a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and roam from north to east, seeking the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. So the time is coming when God will stop speaking to his people because they're not listening. So the silence is coming. Amos warned us, Micah's warning us. Hasn't happened yet, but it will. Verse 8, as for me, however, I am filled with power by the Spirit of the Lord. So right, the silence is coming, so you've got a couple of things, right? You've got the leaders who are enriching themselves and gorging themselves. You've got spiritual leaders who are just speaking wind. They're not speaking what they're supposed to speak. And you have this warning that at some point God's just going to stop speaking altogether because no one's listening. But Micah, right, he's telling them, I am filled, I have the authority to speak, I have the authority to proclaim truth because I have the Holy Spirit. I don't know what exactly the significance is, but I did a study for this just for my Ezekiel class. The language is different for different people. So you've got the language of come upon, you have the language of where, you have the language of empowered, entered. The mainly reason why I did this was because Ezekiel is the only one that's described as the Holy Spirit entering into. He's the only one that gets that language. I don't know the significance of that. But only 2 people in the entire Old Testament are described as filled. So what's the difference between wearing versus filling, or entering versus empowering? Also, only 3 are called to be empowered by the Spirit, as if they're like supernaturally strengthened, and that's Samson, Saul, and David, which is an interesting connection, that Samson, Saul, and David, because you wouldn't think to put those 3 together. But yeah, so the only 2 that are ever described as filled, even though that's a term we like to say, like I am filled with the Spirit, is Joshua and Micah. That's an interesting combination, because I just wouldn't think to put those 2 together. But as for me, I am filled with this power of the Holy Spirit, with justice and courage to proclaim to Jacob his rebellion and to Israel his sin. This is, again, something else that we've kind of seen with Amos, right? So back in Amos 7, we get this, for Amos is mostly a collection of his sermons or bits of his sermons, but then we get this very brief narrative where one of the priests, who has to be a false priest because this is in Israel and it's one of the shrines in Israel, he confronts Amos and tells him, we don't want to hear what you have to say. And he says, so Amos answered Amaziah, I was not a prophet or the son of a prophet, rather I was a herdsman, and I took care of sycamore figs, but the Lord took me from following the flock and said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. And we also are told that part of the reason why he was sent to Israel is because they don't have any prophets anymore. Now, what happened to them? Like, Jonah should be up there. I don't know. But Amos had to go because God told him, go up there and start prophesying to them. And it seems like Micah's in a similar boat. Like, Micah was out doing whatever he was doing, and God said, I need you to be a prophet. So verse 9, listen to this, leaders of the house of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert everything that is right, who build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with injustice. Not that we would know anything about leaders who pervert justice and do everything wrong, right? Or just promote the wrong things. Verse 11, her leaders issue rulings for a bribe, her priests teach for payment, and her prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean on the Lord, saying, isn't the Lord among us? No disaster will overtake us. I did not think to include a slide. I probably should have. This is rather interesting because here we have in one verse all three official designations of leader, right? Because we have basically in Israel three different types of authority. You've got leaders, the presumably public figures. This would be part of the executive establishment, the elders, whatever, people in charge of the military, the politics, and so on. Then you have the priests, who are in charge of the religious establishment. They're the ones in charge of the temple and probably the Levites and so on. And then you have the prophets, who God calls individually, who then go and preach to the people. So these are all three. You've got the public political figures, you've got the religious priests, and then you've got the prophets. And I've used the comparison that in some sense they're supposed to be almost like a checks and balance in Israel, where you've got the, again, the civic political figures, you've got the religious figures, and you've got the prophets kind of in the middle who speak on behalf of God. And they're supposed to keep each other in check. But the problem is they've all gone corrupt. So, if one branch, I don't want to draw too close of a comparison to our political system, but the idea is if one branch gets out of line, whether it's the kingly branch or the priestly branch or whatever, you have two others to kind of balance them out and keep them from going too far astray. But if all three are fallen, then there's nowhere to go. Right? There's nothing to hold Israel together. There's nothing to keep them in check. So the leaders are getting bribes, the priests are taking payments, and they're just, they're all doing their jobs incorrectly. And he goes, yet, and then it's funny, yet they lean on the Lord, saying, isn't the Lord among us? No disaster will overtake us. This is a really biting indictment, right? Because you've got three different offices, all ordained and empowered by Yahweh. And clearly the people in power are not doing their job, and they're taking bribes, which they're not supposed to be taking bribes. And yet they all feel justified because they are in power, because Yahweh has put them in power. So they feel entitled to their position and what they're doing. We've got Amos, who says some similar things, where you've got the people who, they're up in Israel, but they're abusing each other, they're abusing the poor, and deep down they're saying, it's fine what we're doing the rest of the week because we offer our sacrifices and because we still pray to Yahweh. We still do what we're supposed to do, on the Sabbath. He doesn't care what we do the rest of the week. And Amos says, no, that's not right. I do care what you do for the rest of the week. I do care that you fulfill or that you are faithful to Torah. So verse 12. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become ruins, and the hill of the Temple Mount will be a thicket. So the judgment is already happening to Israel. That is ongoing. That is, they're in the process of this being fulfilled. But as we have been warned over and over again, right? Amos warned us, Hosea warned us, that the infestation, right, the disease of Israel's unfaithfulness has found its way into Judah. So Judah is now following in the way of her sister Israel. And because of that, Judah is also going to be judged. And so Micah, who's already saying Israel's in the process of being judged, now the judgment is going to come on Judah. So, chapter 4. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. People will stream to it. So, verse 2, and many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways, so we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this seems to be that we've jumped to something almost apocalyptic. So Israel is going to be judged, or is in the process of being judged. Judah will also experience judgment at some point, although when and how has not been declared yet. But Micah has assured us that, presumably after the judgment is done, Judah, Jerusalem will be restored. And not only that, but that the nations will come. The nations will acknowledge the greatness of Jerusalem. The nations will come in order to observe the blessings that Judah and Jerusalem have. This seems to be, this promise here in Micah 4, 1 and 2, seems to be the promise of fulfilling what was all the way back in Deuteronomy 4. So in Deuteronomy 4, we're told, when they hear about all these statutes, they will say, this great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God near to it as the Lord? Our God is to us whenever we call to him. And what great nation has righteous statutes and ordinances like the entire law I set before you today? So the idea that was established, and I've called it an almost evangelistic nature to Israel. The idea is, Israel, when they're in the land, right, they will follow the Torah, and they will have their temple, and God will bless them. And the idea is that God would bless Israel to such an extent that all the other nations will be curious, and they will want to know, what is it about Israel that makes Israel so special? So they will come, and they will want to be like Israel. Now, did any of that ever happen? No, not yet. It never happened, no. So in verse 9, we're still in Deuteronomy, only be on your guard and diligently watch yourselves so that you don't forget the things your eyes have seen and so that they don't slip from your mind as long as you live. Teach them to your children and your grandchildren. So this is there is sort of an embedded curse in this. On the one side, you have, if you follow Torah, if you do what I tell you to, then God will bless you, and he will continue to bless you. And all the other nations will be envious because they will want to be blessed like you are blessed. But if you don't follow Torah, if you don't do what God tells you to, then he will curse you. And he will curse you to such an extent that all the other nations will go, what on earth did they do to get cursed like this? So either way, they're going to be made an example of. And it can be a good example or it can be a bad example. It's your choice. So that's all kind of embedded in Deuteronomy. And it's sort of parsed out in a couple of places, but Deuteronomy 4 is one of them. So verse 3. He will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. Now we can kind of ask the question, who is this person? So back in Micah 2, one who breaks open the way will advance before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and leave by it. Their king will pass through before them, the Lord as their leader. So are we talking about Yahweh, or are we talking about this new Davidic king? And it seems like at times he's talking about Yahweh, who will be kind of take on the role of king. At other times, it seems like he's talking about there's going to be a new Davidic king. So, which is it? Will the king be Yahweh, or will the king be someone else? Verse 3. He will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. They will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war. So this is clearly something apocalyptic, right? We'll enter into a period where there just is no more war, which hasn't happened yet because it seems like war has never stopped for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. Verse 4. But each man will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree, with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has promised this. So we've already kind of seen this promise back with Amos. So towards the end of Amos, back in chapter 9, I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and occupy ruined cities. This is his promise after the exile takes place. So Israel will be judged, they'll be taken off into exile, but then they will be allowed to return. And they will plant vineyards and drink their wine, make gardens and eat their produce. I will plant them on their land, and they will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them. Yahweh, your God, has spoken. But specifically, this idea that everyone will get their vineyard, they will sit under their vines, and so on, this seems to be a reiteration, or at least the promise of a kind kind of the fulfillment of a promise that was made back to Solomon. So back in 1 Kings 4, throughout Solomon's reign, Judah and Israel lived in safety, from Dan to Beersheba, each man under his own vine and his own fig tree. So Dan, of course, we could talk about the territory, but also the city of Dan, way up in the north, that's the green. Beersheba is usually regarded as the most southern, southwestern edge of Israel. So from Dan to Beersheba basically just means the entirety of Israel. Everyone has their land, everyone has their fig tree, everyone has their vines, and everyone is happy. And what Micah is saying is once all of this takes place, it will be basically like the restoration of all the promises that were given to Solomon. Verse 5. Though all the peoples each walk in the name of their gods, we will walk in the name of Yahweh our God forever and ever. This is really odd that he would say this. So this can't be fully end times because you have other nations and other nations that have other religions. So everyone has not yet come under the umbrella of Yahwism, or they've not all converted to believing in Yahweh. So they're allowed to still believe whatever they want to believe. But Israel, Judah, they will affirm their belief in Yahweh, and they will be true in that. So verse 6, on that day, this is the Lord's declaration, I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. We'll do some, okay. Yeah, okay, I see. So this seems to be, I can't find an earlier example of this in the prophets. This is a rather interesting claim that he makes. And it's something that other prophets will pick up, especially Jeremiah. But we're not doing Jeremiah. That when Yahweh, when he renews his nation, right, when he renews his people, he is going to build a nation of the lame, those who have been scattered, those who have been injured. Jeremiah, I believe it's Jeremiah, he's the one who talks about how you think that because you were left in the land, or because you'll be left in the land, you are special to Yahweh. But in reality, it's those who were sent away that God cares about, that God's going to, he's removed in order to protect them. So the point is, he's going to build his nation of the weak, of the infirmed, of those that he has hurt. He recognizes that he has hurt people, and he is going to make things right. Now, this idea, even though the idea of the nation itself being restored with the lame and so on, this seems to be something new that Micah is talking about. But all the way back in Deuteronomy, we were told, the Lord was devoted to you and chose you, not because you were more numerous than all peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your fathers. He brought you out with a strong hand and redeemed you from the place of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And it's uttered other places as well, that part of the reason why God chose Israel to make Israel his people is because they were weak, because they were small, because they were insignificant, so that when they became great, everyone would know it was because of Yahweh and not because of them. So the idea of God taking the weak and making them great is something that we've seen built up over time. One of the best places to go is Hannah's prayer. So back in 1 Samuel 2, the Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the garbage pile. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them. So, and talk about the nation, talk about people. And, of course, I can easily jump to when Jesus came, who did he want to associate with? It was mainly the beggars and the lame and the prostitutes and so on, the people that were generally discarded by society. They're the ones that he has compiled his kingdom from. So all of that goes back to Micah. So verse 7, I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation. Then the Lord will rule over them in Mount Zion from this time for forever. And again, we've already had this promise that the king is returning, that the king is going to rule himself. Hosea talked about this. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. Isaiah, right? He has a lot to say about the promise of this king who will come and will rule over the remnant. The dominion will be vast, and his prosperity will never end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So verse 8, and you, watchtower for the flock, fortified hill of daughter Zion, the former rule will come to you, sovereignty will come to daughter Zion, or daughter Jerusalem. So we've got reference to daughter Zion. We'll talk about that in a second. But the watchtower, right? The watchtower, the watchman, is a fairly common reference to the prophets. They're the ones that have been situated in a way to look for the signs of danger, to look for signs of Yahweh, and to let the people know what's happening. So Hosea, back in chapter 9, Ephraim's watchman is with my God. The prophet encounters a fowler's snare on all his ways. Hostility is in the house of his God. So he even says the watchman and then the prophet, because watchman is a fairly common term to refer to the prophets, the most famous of which is going to be Ezekiel. As for you, son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. When you hear a word from my mouth, give them a warning from me. And plenty of prophets refer to themselves or to other prophets as the watchmen. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Micah, and Habakkuk all love the term watchman. So this is not something exclusive to Micah or new to Micah, but he's going to use it. So verse 9, now why are you shouting loudly? Is there no king with you? Has your counselor perished so that anguish grips you like a woman in labor? So the people are responding. I assume they're not very happy. They have no king to lead them. And we kind of saw Hosea deal with the same thing, that they've sort of broken away from their king, partly because the king had been corrupt, and you had this string of deaths, and so they were at the point where it's like, why do we even need a king? Right? We can just do whatever we want. And obviously they can't because things were getting increasingly bad. Like, you need a king. You need someone who is going to represent the authority of God on earth. And because the leadership has gone so far afield and they've been derelict in fulfilling that duty, Yahweh is just fed up because I'm going to do it myself. Right? I'm going to come and I'm going to rule you personally. So verse 10, writhe and cry out, daughter Zion. Now this is a phrase, I've brought this up before, this is a phrase that we see a lot in Isaiah. He loves the term daughter Zion. It refers to Jerusalem, but we have the personification of Jerusalem, right? Writhe and cry out, daughter Zion, like a woman in labor, for now you will leave the city and camp in the open fields. You will go to Babylon. So he's personifying Zion, Jerusalem, and saying, you're crying, you're upset, but you need to know, you need to accept that you're going to be carried away. You're going to be taken captive and carried to Babylon. So this is looking forward to the future. And then he goes, you go to Babylon. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the power of your enemies. And yes. So this was a while ago. This was over a year ago. One of the first things that I did was I did a brief little study on the Emmanuel prophecy. I did it on Are You My Alma, because this is a paper that I wrote. And we talked about the Emmanuel, Isaiah 7:14, right? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. And the point that I made, and this is what I argued in my paper, is that this specifically, right, what Micah right here is talking about is the setup of Isaiah. And this is what, that Micah is giving us context, and that he and Isaiah are talking about basically the same thing. So when, we're going to see it developed, but when it talks about how daughter Zion is like a woman in labor, the reason why he's saying that is because she is in labor. So daughter Zion is on the verge of giving birth. And what I think is going to happen, at least my interpretation of it, is Daughter Zion is pregnant. She's going to be taken into captivity, and she will give birth in captivity. And daughter Zion's child is going to be the remnant. I think Micah is going to explain this to us as we go through the rest of the chapters, chapter 4 and 5. So he's setting up the idea that Zion is pregnant, and that Zion is going to give birth to the remnant, and the remnant is going to come back, right? So Jerusalem will essentially be replaced with the remnant. This is all in Micah. And I think that here, talking about daughter Zion and daughter Zion being pregnant and daughter Zion giving birth is what Isaiah is talking about back in chapter 7, about the virgin who's going to conceive, she's going to get pregnant, she's going to give birth, and so on, and that her child is going to lead the remnant, I think is parallel to Micah's prophecy here in chapter 4. But that was my whole point in that earlier presentation. So in verse 11, many nations have now assembled against you. They say, let her be defiled, and let us feast our eyes on Zion. But they do not know the Lord's intentions or understand his plan, for he has gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor. So, as we already know, right, so it's not clear what exactly he's talking about at the moment. So is he talking about the immediate context, about later on? But at this moment, the nations have gathered together. They're going to judge Israel, and they're going to come against Jerusalem. This could be talking about the Assyrians and how the Assyrians are on their, in their conquest of Israel, they're going to try and take over Jerusalem. And we know from 2 Kings, as well as Isaiah, that God doesn't let that happen. So he judges the Assyrians for attempting to conquer Jerusalem. It could also be that he is going to use the period of the exile and so on as another way or another, setting up the terms for judging Babylon and later the Persians and so on. But that this is all, again, all part of God's plan. So verse 13, rise and thresh, daughter Zion, for I will make your horns iron and your hooves bronze, so you can crush many peoples. Then you will set apart their plunder to the Lord for destruction, their wealth to the Lord of all the earth. So he's going to empower Zion at some point so that Zion can fight back and defeat her enemies, although when exactly he envisions this is not clear. Chapter 5. Now, daughter who is under attack, you slash yourself in grief. A siege is set against us. They are striking the judge of Israel on the cheek with a rod. Verse 2. Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. So this is a very famous verse. This is one of the verses that Matthew talks about when the wise men come to Herod and they ask, where is the Messiah going to be born? He actually quotes Micah 5:2 to tell them it's going to be in Bethlehem. So one will come from you to be ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity, from eternity. Again, we've already had the promise of the Messiah. Hosea talks about this. Isaiah talks about this a lot. Verse 3. Therefore, he will abandon them until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. The person in labor has to be daughter Zion. So daughter Zion is going to give birth to someone. Presumably, it's going to be the remnant. Then the rest of his brothers will return to the people of Israel. He will stand and shepherd them in the strength of Yahweh and the majestic name of Yahweh his God. They will live securely, for then his greatness will extend to the ends of the earth. So Zion's going to give birth. And everyone's going to return to Israel. At this point, the leader of the remnant, this Messiah, this Messianic king, he will rule from Israel, and it's going to bring about this period of peace, prosperity, and so on. And again, I take this pronouncement of the woman in labor who is giving birth or about to give birth. I think that Micah 5:3 is referring to the same child back in Isaiah 7:14, that they're talking about the same woman. They're talking about the same child. So verse 5, he will be their peace, this messianic leader of the remnant. When Assyria invades our land, when it marches against our fortresses, we will raise against it 7 shepherds, even 8 leaders of men. They will shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword. The land of Nimrod will be with a drawn blade. So he will rescue us from Assyria when it invades our land, when it marches against our territory. Well, Assyria is probably going to be a little symbolic because we already know that daughter Zion is going to be taken into captivity by the Babylonians, but Assyria is the main world power at the time. Presumably he's talking about whoever the world authority is at that moment, this leader of the remnant is going to lead an army against that. So this could be talking about the eschatological final battle, when the Messiah will lead his forces against this final army, whatever, like what Joel is talking about. But again, we do know that when Assyria marches against Jerusalem, which is going to happen pretty soon, God obviously doesn't allow the Assyrians to take Jerusalem because he has not given them over to Assyria yet, right? Because Judah, Jerusalem will be taken by Babylon. So verse 7, then the remnant of Jacob will be among many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which do not wait for anyone or linger for mankind. We've already seen the dew metaphor. Hosea, he used at the beginning about how dew is kind of fleeting and your faith is like dew. But then at the end, he talks about how Yahweh will be like the dew to Israel, so that he will blossom like a lily and take root like the cedars of Lebanon. So Hosea uses dew in a positive way, just like Micah is. Verse 8, then the remnant of Jacob will be among the nations, among many peoples, like a lion among animals of the forest, like a young lion among flocks of sheep, which trample and tears as it passes through. And there is no one to rescue them. Your hand will be lifted up against your adversaries, and all your enemies will be destroyed. Verse 10, in that day, this is the Lord's declaration, I will remove your horses from you and wreck your chariots. So at this point, as we go through, Judah has been taken into captivity. She's given birth. They've come back. The Messiah is now ruling in Israel, ruling in Judah. He has defeated their enemies. Everything is wonderful. Everything is peaceful, and so on. And at this point, there aren't going to be any horses. And this is probably tied all the way back to like the prohibition against the king, right? The king is not allowed to hoard gold. He can't hoard women, and he can't hold horses. He can't hoard horses. The reason for that is because horses are tied to the army. So we're even told there are not going to be any horses and not going to be any chariots because these are weapons of war. They're not going to have any weapons. They're not going to have any, they're not going to need them anymore. We were already told they're not going to have swords anymore because we're not going to need them. So verse 11, I will remove the cities of your land and tear down all your fortresses. I will remove sorceries from your hands, and you will not have any more fortune tellers. So it's not clear what he means by there won't be any more cities. Presumably, the fortresses will be removed because they won't need fortresses anymore because, again, it's all going to be peaceful and wonderful. I will remove sorceries. There's not going to be any false worship. There's not going to be any false religious leaders. There's not going to be fortune tellers, as we should already know from the Torah. You're not allowed to do divination. You're not allowed to go to augurs and so on. So they're all going to be removed. Verse 13, I will remove your carved images and sacred pillars from you so that you will not bow down again to the work of your hands. I will pull up the Asherah poles from among you and demolish your cities. So this is very similar to something that Hosea talked about, kind of towards the end. He said, their hearts are devious. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars and demolish their sacred pillars. So as part of God's judgment against Israel, he's going to take away all their false worship. However, this is Micah. He's talking about Israel and Judah, presumably, after the Messiah has come. And so all of this is being removed, right? All the idols, all the sacred pillars, the Asherah poles. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between an Asherah pole and a sacred pillar. We get a glimpse of what the Asherah poles are. So back in 1 Samuel 7, Samuel told them, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, get rid of the foreign gods and the Asherahs, probably Asherah poles, that are among you. Asherah, I've already mentioned this in that context, but we can go over it again, is the ancient Sumerian goddess of fertility. She was the consort of Baal. She was consort to Anu. She was the queen of heaven. And the way you worshipped her was through worshiping these tree-like objects. And we're not entirely sure what those objects were exactly. So some have theorized that the Asherah poles were like groves, or perhaps more appropriately, they're like parks. So you had sacred parks that you would go and you would do religious activities, probably sexual in nature. So you had these parks, they were set aside, and then you could go and you could worship Asherah or whatever in those parks. The other theory is that the Asherah poles are something like totem poles. So they're trees that have been stripped down, they've been painted, they've been decorated, and then you would use them in some sort of cultic festival. One of the clearest stories about the Asherah poles is from Gideon, right? God shows up to Gideon and tells him, oh, great warrior. And then he says, I want you to go and chop down the poles. So Gideon does not ask, where are they, right? Gideon knows what they are. So again, is it some sort of park that's been sort of roped off or set aside? Or are they like totem poles? Again, we don't really know because we don't have any. We haven't found any because they're trees, essentially. So they've deteriorated. But regardless, they're used in pagan rituals, pagan festivals, and the locals know what they are. Gideon knows what these poles are, and he knows that they're not good. So he goes with his buddies or whatever, and they chop them down. Verse 15. I will take vengeance in anger and wrath against the nations that have not obeyed me. So Israel is going to be restored. They're going to be led by this remnant, the king of the remnant, and they're going to be blessed. It's going to be wonderful. There's not going to be any more foreign, any false worship, any false leaders. And we do know that that other people, other nations will be allowed to enjoy Israel, to be able to interact with them, and so on. But, as we've already said, and kind of already iterated, that God is going to punish all of those who have acted against Yahweh's wishes and against his people. This has already been stated, essentially going all the way back to the beginning of Amos. So, Amos was the first book that we looked at, and he begins by saying God is going to judge all of these other nations, right? Because of what they've done, how they've mistreated Israel and Judah and so on. So that's already on the books, right? That's already going to take place. But he tells us before that can happen, Israel has to be judged. And after Israel is judged, Judah is going to be judged. And after Judah is judged, then everyone else gets judged. But again, there's an order to things. And so Micah is telling us this is going to happen, right? The other nations are going to be dealt with. They're going to be punished. There's going to be a restoration of judgment, but just like Amos had told us, that won't happen until Judah is judged, Judah goes into exile, and then Judah returns from exile and is under the rule of this new remnant king. So we will end there tonight. Okay. That sounds right. The Assyrians were particular, because I think we've talked about that at some point. These. Maybe, but the Assyrians. But if he's talking mainly about Judah, they're not going to be judged by Assyria. They'll be judged by Babylon. But yeah, the Assyrians were known for being very brutal. Trying to think. I think it's Isaiah who talks about how brutal the Assyrians are. Yeah, I think it's Isaiah. And I can't remember if it's here or not. We have found, off the top of my head, we have found engravings, carvings, and so on from Assyrian cities, buildings, where they will, they'll make artistic depictions of torture, because that's just part of their culture, and they're very good at it, and they're very proud of it. Like, they're proud of how, we have texts from them just basically going through describing how to torture people. I mean, they were a very brutal people.